Hi there, I'm Christine, and this is the Freedom Update, the bi-weekly video podcast from the Canadian Constitution Foundation, where we talk about our ongoing cases, give you interesting updates about constitutional law from across Canada, and tell you about our exciting upcoming events. Thanks for tuning in, and let's talk about freedom. This was an exciting week because the Canadian Constitution Foundation was in the Supreme Court on Monday on a case called Ward and the Quebec Human Rights Commission. We were interveners who appeared as a friend of the court to ask the Supreme Court to take a broad view of the right to freedom of expression. The underlying case, which we were not a party to, involved a Quebec comedian named Mike Ward. Mr. Ward specializes in black or dark humor, and in 2016, the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal ordered Mr. Ward to pay $42,000 in damages to the subject of a series of jokes he told between 2010 and 2013. The jokes that led to the fine were about sacred cows in Quebec, people who, because of their power, their wealth, or their sympathy, were considered untouchable by comedians. And one of the targets of his joke was a boy named Jeremy Gabriel, a young disabled singer. Mr. Ward made jokes about Mr. Gabriel's appearance, about his illness, and about his singing talent, and joked about drowning him. Like many dark jokes, Mr. Ward's jokes were cruel and they were unsettling. When they were described in the Supreme Court, the jokes were without a doubt not funny and indeed vicious. And there's also no doubt that the jokes hurt Mr. Gabriel, who was repeatedly bullied at school because of these jokes, and in fact was bullied to the point where he became suicidal. This is tragic, and it's incredibly sympathetic. There's a strong public desire for Mr. Gabriel to have some type of recourse against an adult who targeted him and caused him tremendous suffering. But in a free and democratic society, that recourse doesn't rest with the government. It lays with private law remedies like a claim of defamation or perhaps the newly created tort of online harassment. Allowing the Quebec government to set the limits on comedy through these enormous fines creates a chilling effect for other performers in the province, and it's an undue limit on the right to freedom of expression. Speech, even controversial and repugnant speech, is protected from unjustified government intrusion. And even if Mr. Ward's comedy routine was distasteful, it should not be policed by the government. Like all comedy, it should be policed by audiences. We appeared at the Supreme Court not to defend the jokes, but to ensure that the court takes a broad view of the charter-protected right to freedom of expression. There were many interveners in that case on both sides of the issue, and we're really looking forward to the result. If you're interested, you can follow along, and we'll keep you updated through this video update and through our mailing list, which you can sign up for at www.theccf.ca. There are some interesting constitutional developments from across Canada, and this week we're checking in with the federal government again, which has now finally published the regulations about quarantine hotels and for travelers returning to Canada. Now, as I mentioned in my last video update, the federal government has announced a new set of restrictions for travelers returning to Canada. Starting on February 22nd, travelers into Canada will be required to get a COVID test to board a plane, and they now must get a COVID test when they land. And while they wait for the results of that second test, they're required to quarantine for up to 3 days in a government quarantine hotel. The cost for the test and this quarantine stay is estimated to be over $2,000 per traveler, which they must pay themselves. This week, the federal government finally announced the regulations that outlined some of the important details of these quarantine hotels, including the exemptions. Now, importantly, the government has created an exemption for individuals who are traveling for medical care outside of Canada. Now, I have broad concerns about the quarantine hotels in general, which I've outlined many times, but I was extremely concerned about the vulnerability of people who are traveling for medical care. And I wrote twice to the federal government specifically about creating an exemption for people traveling for medical treatment outside of Canada. And it looks like the government listened because they did grant this exemption. While there's still obviously problems with quarantine hotels, the exemption was extremely urgent for medical travel because the health and indeed lives of people who need to travel for medical treatment could actually be jeopardized if they were forced into a government quarantine hotel that couldn't meet their medical needs. The regulations have also created an exemption for people traveling into Canada for compassionate reasons. These travelers need to apply for an exemption from the Minister of Health, which is granted for people who are coming to Canada to visit a loved one who's at the end of their life or to help a loved one who needs special medical care or to attend a funeral, and it's subject to approval by the minister. Now, this is an important exemption, but what's troubling to me is that it only goes one way. If you need to come into Canada to help a sick loved one, you can apply for an exemption. You don't have to stay at this $2,000 quarantine hotel. But if you need to go to another country to see a sick loved one, attend a funeral, or attend a death, you can't apply for the exemption for the quarantine hotel when you return. Why would the government grant the exemption in one of those scenarios, which they clearly contemplated, but not grant it in the other? It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's also interesting to note that there's no exemption for travelers who are vaccinated and therefore have very little, if any, ability to transmit the virus. We're also disappointed to see that there's no exemption for cross-border families. If your husband or wife lives in the United States or another country, which is a surprisingly common situation, it now costs an additional $2,000 to be together. The reality is that these quarantine hotels aren't necessary at all. Travelers can be trusted to quarantine at home. The government has presented no evidence that people who widely violate the home quarantine requirements. And indeed, across Canada, only about 100 tickets related to this have been issued. So in the absence of any evidence, imposing a quarantine requirement in a government facility is excessive. We're currently reviewing all of our legal options, including participating in a claim challenging the restrictions or bringing a claim on behalf of one of the literally thousands of people who have contacted me about this issue. I'll be sure to keep you updated. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch our video updates, or you can join our mailing list at theccf.ca. I have some exciting events to tell you about, and I hope you'll be able to join me. The first is the annual Law and Freedom Conference, which is put on by our friends at the Runnymede Society. The conference is on March 12th and 13th, and it's taking place virtually. We're especially honored that this year the keynote speech will be by Justice Malcolm Rowe of the Supreme Court of Canada. Some of the other topics at the conference will include the future of parliamentary democracy, forgotten freedoms, and originalism. I hope you'll be able to join us. I've also started hosting the national TV program, Canadian Justice, full-time now on the News Forum. The show airs on Bell, TELUS Satellite, and Access, or you can stream it on YouTube. Upcoming episodes are going to examine youth sentencing laws and laws that ban paid blood donations. And I hope you'll be able to tune in because those are really some fascinating topics. That's all for this update. Thanks for tuning in, and let's keep fighting for freedom in Canada.